on Nation to Nation. Emergency meeting on Child and Family Services begins in Ottawa. At stake are thousands of children going into care.
They are so disconnected from their family and from their community that they are totally lost.
The province of Ontario says it's committed to First Nations control of childcare.
The First Nations communities never released the authority for others to protect or govern over their children.
Nunavut Senator Dennis Patterson will soon be visiting all 25 communities in his territory.
I think it's really important that residents of the Arctic have input into the development of this Arctic policy by our federal government.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamarand. Welcome to Nation to Nation. 7% of children in Canada are Indigenous, but they make up just over half of those in care. Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott has characterized it as a humanitarian crisis. So she met with Aboriginal leaders and provincial representatives today, at day one of an emergency meeting on Child and Family Services.
Let me say at the outset that today and tomorrow are not about assigning blame. It is about acknowledging the severity and the importance of the crisis and determining how each one of us can be part of the solution, part of the urgent need for reform, to keep our children and families together.
The Anishinaabe Nation is an important stakeholder. It represents 49 First Nations in Northern Ontario. Joining me now is NAN's Deputy Grand Chief, Anna Betty Achni-Paniskum, who also holds the Child and Family Services portfolio. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you very much, Todd, for having us.
Now, if I can just ask you off the start here, give me a sense of just how deep this crisis is, especially in NAN territory.
You know, since I've had this file, which hasn't been long, compared to the crisis regarding our children, I have found out that we have had 6 children die in care since January 2014. 6 children that were in foster care or in group home. We also, over half of our children that are in care are also sent out of the community to southern and eastern urban centers, where many times these children do not have an opportunity to return to their community, and when they do, they are so disconnected from their family and from their community that they are totally lost.
I guess give me a sense. It's been about 3/4 of day one has now passed. What sense do you get from what you've heard so far about how this crisis could be tackled?
Well, we heard many great comments from Minister Philpott and other Indigenous leaders this morning as they did their opening. And, sadly, my view is that this conversation, this discussion is long overdue. Now we are at this stage, we have so many children in care, we have lost so many children who have died while in care, and the resources are still flowing through other urban centers. And my view is that this conversation should have happened 2 decades ago. And I'm glad it's happening, and I believe that many of our Indigenous communities, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, have many processes in place already. So it's just a matter of us getting together, working together for the benefit of our children.
Did you hear anything today? You think that perhaps we're at a turning point, that we're over the hump when it comes to this crisis, and things might be better, say, a year or 2 from now?
Like I said, we've been having this discussion for years in our communities and within our family circles, and it's now a nationwide discussion. Finally, the federal government is seeing that it is a crisis situation, and that is very crucial for us to continue moving forward.
In this province, though, they're not keeping track of, they keep overall track of how many kids are in care, but not how many are Indigenous. Does that lack of data affect how you go about your business?
It does, and we've been having, we've also been trying to collect data in terms of how many outside resources are, getting funds that they are supposed to provide for our children, and also we've been collecting some data, but it isn't sufficient, and we will continue to do so, and we
Is
have.
it going to help? The province promised that next month on February 5th they're going to start. I guess a year down the road we might actually have some data. At that point, will it help you, do you think?
It will, and we've been collecting some bits and pieces of our own, our own data, and so we're utilizing that to work with our chiefs, and for us to ensure that they continue to support the process, for us to have our own child welfare system and our own laws, our own APTN Nation child advocate, and those are the positions that we are taking, and it's good to. It's very encouraging that our leadership support that.
Do you think the province will get on board? I'll be interviewing Michael Coto immediately after you today. Do you think they'll be on board in facilitating this devolution to First Nations?
I think they're a long ways away from that. Until they change those policies that continue to discriminate against our children, until they turn it around to ensure that they fund more prevention instead of protection, we're going to be in that place. So that's why we need to continue to advocate, to lobby, and to speak out in a very assertive way. And that's what we will do.
Of course, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott has said many times over the last couple of months that there is going to be an increase for child and family services in the upcoming federal budget. Do you anticipate that will be enough?
Well, I don't believe it will, but it is a good start. And until we are in that place where we can have more data, then we will, eventually reach that point where our child and family service agencies and other resources and services are funded equitably.
You talked about you, of course, want to take control of your own agencies so your children come home. I suppose, what about the children who are currently in urban agencies like in Sudbury or Toronto or here in Ottawa? Do you think they'll be affected one day as well?
Well, we have to include those children. Those children, we have to take those steps to bring our children home, and we can't exclude them. They need to be part of the processes that we have in place, because that is our objective, is to have our own processes and resources to take care of our children, to have them close to our home, to prevent them from going into those places, into those, to out of the community.
I'm thinking about families who have been in the city maybe for decades, or who are kind of disconnected from their communities up north or wherever. How do you account for them? Well,
we are fortunate to have those child welfare agencies that do provide services to our families that are in urban centers. So they must ensure that they have the same mandates in terms of more prevention and more family supports and more kinship, opportunities, and so those resources should be available for them as well.
Well, it'll be interesting to see where we stand a year from now. I want to thank you, Deputy Grand Chief, for coming in and talking to me.
Thank you very much.
After the break, Ontario's Minister of Child and Family Services, Michael Coto, joins me in studio. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Solving the crisis of children in care can't be done without provincial involvement. Ontario has nearly 14,000 children and youth in various aid societies, but there is no data on how many of them are Indigenous. province hasn't kept track, although there is a plan to do so starting next month. Joining me in studio is Ontario's Minister of Child and Family Services, Michael Coto. Minister Coto, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me here.
Now, Minister Philpott earlier today called this one of the biggest challenges, which was to get data on Indigenous people and children in care across Canada. Why has Ontario not done this in the past?
Well, you know, we have to look at where the child protection services came from historically, and you know, there are many different agencies that existed, a lot of them set up through external organizations. I just brought forward probably the most comprehensive piece of legislation here in Ontario in regards to changes to child protection. And in that legislation, along with the work we're doing on the Anti-Racism Directorate, we have the ability to mandate disaggregated race-based data collection. And other types of data. So we're working with our CASs to mandate that right across the province to do that. We know that it'll allow us to make better decisions. The other thing we've done is we put in a CPIN
I guess
system.
without that data up until now, wouldn't it have made it hard to make good decisions, I guess, up until
Absolutely.
now?
So I agree with you 100%, and that's why a few years ago we started the transition into a central database for our agencies. So more than half of our children's aid societies now are on a central database. It's called CPIN. And what we do is we have one central system that links child protection services. So before, everyone had their own database system. So if you're a family, for example, in Thunder Bay, and you move to a place like Timmins, Ontario, that data would not be transferred. It would be done either manually or sometimes not transferred at all. So with the introduction of a central database system, which we've invested a lot of time and resources into, we'll have a global, provincial understanding of where people are, and it'll benefit the system as a whole.
Now, of course, you've come to the meeting today. I don't know what you've heard already, but was there anything you heard that maybe we can go forward and do something about this crisis? I know certainly in the past year there have been some deaths of kids in care, especially here in Ottawa.
Yeah, we're actually starting this evening. The deputy ministers met earlier today, and the bureaucrats. But I think there are some big opportunities. You know, over the last several years, Ontario's really worked alone without a federal partner. There was not much interest from the Harper government to work with provinces on this important file. We now have a government, a prime minister, a minister responsible for this file to work trilaterally. It's not just you know, between government, provincially and federally. It's working with First Nation leadership in Ontario, and that's something that our premier has prioritized for our government. And I think a good reflection of that is our Indigenous child and youth strategy, which was built with the leadership across the province and signed off by, you know, our Grand Council chiefs here in Ontario. So it's a strategy that was built by inviting all players to the table to agree on it together in partnership, and it was endorsed by the leadership across the province, so we could go forward on a journey together that's reflected on reconciliation and partnership building.
Now, of course, a lot of First Nations, not just here but in other provinces, would like the province to get out of the CFS business, to devolve responsibility completely to them. So I guess the funding goes from federal government to them, and the province is out. Do you foresee that happening in
It's
Ontario?
already happening. So Ontario is a leader in that space. You know, out of 144 First Nations in Ontario, 108 currently are designated, have some type of designation that goes back to an Indigenous-led CAS. But we signed an historical agreement. I signed an agreement with the Anishinaabe Nation recently, and before that, Treaty 3, for full jurisdictional control over child protection. So the Premier believes in this approach. You know, I know that First Nations communities never released the authority for others to protect or govern over their children, and our government is going down a pathway of partnership that will provide the resources necessary for full jurisdictional control over the most important thing in a community, and that's children, right?
Do you think you've got a time frame on when you might get out of the CFS business altogether?
Well, you know, it would be great to just be out of the business and have kids be with their families. Unfortunately, in Ontario, there are kids that need help from government. But, you know, I've traveled to so many different communities in Northern Ontario, different parts of Ontario, Indigenous communities, and I'll tell you, the worst thing you could ever do is to remove a child from a community and send them to a faraway place. And I've seen situations where young people eventually, you know, get older and they've lost full connection with their original community. It's a shame that that happens. And that's why we're looking at ways to make sure that young people can stay close to home when they need those services. And I'll tell you, one of the other things that we've done that's, I think, pretty remarkable as a province is we've changed the child protection laws in this province. The legislation that we've changed acknowledges that racism is real, that Indigenous, anti-Indigenous racism and colonialism exist, and it is a big part of the challenges and the problems that we see here in Canada today.
I'll have to cut you off.
Yeah,
sorry,
no worries, no worries.
But I want to thank you for appearing on Nation to Nation.
Thank you for your time.
After the break, I talked to the Senator of Nunavut, Dennis Patterson. He plans to visit every community in his territory. Welcome back to Nation to Nation. Senator Dennis Patterson is currently the Far North's only representative in the Senate, as seats in the Yukon and Northwest Territories remain vacant. Patterson represents Nunavut and is planning an ambitious tour of all 25 communities there in February and March. He's also deputy chair of the newly created Senate Committee on the Arctic. He joins me now from Vancouver via Skype. Welcome to Nation, Senator Patterson.
Good day, thank you.
Now, in an already crowded committee schedule, why add one that's focusing specifically on the Arctic?
Well, all eyes are on the Arctic right now for many reasons. There's the issue of climate change. There is increased interest in the Arctic for navigation and resource development, including the fishery. There are pressing social issues like housing, food security, suicide, addictions, and I think it's timely to focus on the Arctic because the current federal government has stated its desire to develop an Arctic policy framework this year, and I think it's really important that residents of the Arctic have input into the development of this Arctic policy by our federal government.
Do you think the federal government will listen? I know I had the Premier of the Northwest Territories on the show a couple of months ago, and he was a bit upset that the federal government seemed to be ignoring his territory, especially over the oil and gas moratorium.
Well, you know, frankly, I think the current government, which has promised to reach out to Aboriginal people and consult them, may have been a little bit chagrined that at having to admit that the Arctic oil and gas moratorium that was announced roughly a year ago was put in place in an arrangement with then President Barack Obama and our Prime Minister, with no consultation whatsoever with Northern folks, Northern governments, Northern Aboriginal leaders. It is, you know, no secret that that was done without consultation. So I think now they're more open than ever before to respecting Northern input into Arctic policy, possibly because of that misstep with the oil and gas moratorium.
Now, the chair, Senator Charlie Watt, is actually leaving the Senate. So his departure is kind of sudden. What does that do to how and when you get down to business with this committee?
Well, Senator Watt was elected as president of the Makivik Corporation last week, and I think he's announced his intention to, at some point, resign from the Senate. We're going to be having a steering committee of the Senate committee this coming week, and we'll determine the timing. But I know Senator Watt is keenly interested in the issues that will be discussed by the Senate committee, including sovereignty and the role of the Inuit in the offshore. And I'm confident that he'll be able to participate in the committee, whether he's doing so as president of Makivik Corporation, representing the Inuit of Nunavut, Northern Quebec, or whether he will be able to do so while remaining in the Senate for a period of time.
Senator Patterson, just to change topics a little, I understand you're going to be visiting all 25 communities in February and March. Why are you doing that?
I was invited to a meeting of the mayors of Nunavut, the 25 mayors of Nunavut in December, and they presented quite a strong concern that federal initiatives, in particular the bill to legalize marijuana, have been undertaken without any consultation with them or any opportunity for them to express their concerns, which include the operation of workplaces and municipalities and heavy equipment, attendance at schools, mental health issues of concern. And so they encouraged me to come and visit communities and hear from citizens about this important legislation that's before the Senate at this moment. And of course, there are many other issues, including the carbon tax that will be is expected to be imposed upon Nunavut in the coming year with its already sky-high cost of living. So I told the mayors I would give their communities and their people a voice in the Senate, and that was a real impetus for me to organize this tour.
What is the main concern from the people you've heard already about the new cannabis law?
Well, the Nunavut Tungavik Incorporated, which represents 85% of the people of Nunavut, had an annual general meeting last year, and they said that the federal government has a requirement under their land claim to consult them on major policy or legislative initiatives which will affect Inuit. And they said strongly at their meeting that they had not been consulted, that consultation with ITK, the National Inuit Organization based in Ottawa, was not consultation with NTI, and that they should be consulted. The mayor said the same thing. We feel left out. We need to have our voices heard. So the main impetus is to get the views and concerns of residents of Nunavut and build that into my consideration of my position on the bill that's now before the Senate, which I fully intend to do.
Okay, thank you again for taking some time this morning from Vancouver to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. Good day.
Next week, Parliament is up and running again, and our political panel will be back after a 6-week absence. There will certainly be a lot to talk about. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Have a great evening.